I had always believed that a father's love knew no limits, that the sacrifices we made for our children were simply part of the unspoken contract of life. And so when my daughter asked to live in my house rent-free, I welcomed her with open arms, imagining that my generosity would teach her gratitude and foster a stronger bond between us. Yet I could never have predicted how swiftly that trust would be turned into entitlement. How a daughter I had nurtured and supported would come to view my kindness as weakness, as an opportunity to treat me with disdain, to dismiss my opinions, and to act as though the life I had built with my own hands was her birthright rather than a home I had earned through decades of hard work. At first, the offenses were small, subtle slights in casual conversation. Impatience when I asked her to help with simple chores, eye rolls and muttered complaints that stung more than words should. And I told myself that this was the natural rebellion of youth, that eventually she would come to understand the weight of responsibility and the value of respect. But each passing day revealed new depths of arrogance and ingratitude, culminating one afternoon when I decided to pay her a surprise visit, hoping to reconnect and share a quiet moment, only to be met with icy glares, sharp rebukes, and the shocking declaration that I should leave, that she no longer wished to have me in her house. A statement so cruel and incomprehensible that it left me momentarily speechless, my heart heavy with the realization that all the patience, all the love I had poured into her life had been met not with appreciation, but with contempt. And in that instant, a quiet resolve began to form within me, a determination not to argue, not to beg, but to take control of the situation in a way that would ensure both justice and the preservation of my dignity. And so I began to plan in silence, reaching out to buyers discreetly, preparing the paperwork, orchestrating the sale of the house.
She had called hers while keeping every detail hidden from her, all the while maintaining a calm exterior, concealing the storm of emotions that raged beneath, knowing that the day of revelation would come. And when it did, it would teach her a lesson she had refused to learn about respect, gratitude, and the consequences of entitlement. And so I waited, watching her continue to flaunt her authority over a home that was no longer hers to command, seeing the shock and confusion cross her face when she returned one afternoon to discover the irrevocable truth, hearing the screams, the frantic pleas, the desperate attempts to reclaim what she had squandered through arrogance, and through it all, I remained quiet, observing the chaos I had orchestrated with a mixture of sorrow and relief, understanding that while the pain of this confrontation was inevitable, it was necessary for both of us to find clarity. And as the dust settled, the house now legally in the hands of new owners, my daughter, humbled and speechless, I finally felt a sense of freedom, a reclamation of both my property and my dignity, and in that moment, I realized that love is not simply about sacrifice, but also about setting boundaries, about ensuring that generosity is met with respect, and that even the closest of bonds can only thrive when gratitude, humility, and decency are honored. And as I walked away from the chaos that had once been my home, I carried with me not only the lessons of a difficult relationship, but also a quiet triumph, knowing that the life I had built, the respect I had earned, and the peace I had finally reclaimed were victories that no one could take away, and that my daughter, now forced to confront the consequences of her behavior, would forever carry the memory of a lesson learned too late. A testament to the inescapable truth that entitlement and cruelty inevitably meet their match in patience, strategy, and the quiet strength of a parent who knows the value of both love and justice. After that fateful confrontation, I retreated to the quiet of my home, where every wall, every corner, every floorboard carried decades of memories, from the laughter of family dinners to the quiet moments of reflection, and I began to consider my next steps with careful precision, knowing that any hasty decision would only fuel further chaos and give my daughter another opportunity to assert her arrogance. I contacted a trusted real estate agent, one who understood discretion and the delicate nature of a house tied so deeply to family history, and I arranged meetings with potential buyers who were unaware of the personal storm about to unfold, making sure each conversation and negotiation occurred behind closed doors, far from my daughter's eyes, and yet, as I meticulously planned the sale, I could not ignore the twinge of sorrow that accompanied each step, for this house was more than bricks and mortar. It was a repository of memories, a testament to the years of hard work, love, and dedication that had shaped not only my life, but also the early life of my daughter, who now treated all of it with disdain. During these weeks of quiet orchestration, I observed her behavior with a mixture of fascination and growing frustration, seeing how she strutted through the house as if it were her kingdom, ignoring the small acts of kindness that had once defined our relationship, dismissing my presence when I dared to offer advice, and flaunting her material comfort while showing no appreciation for the sacrifices that had provided it. And each incident only reinforced my conviction that the sale of the house was not merely a financial transaction, but a moral lesson that she needed, a moment of reckoning that could neither be postponed nor softened. For if love alone could not teach her respect, then reality surely would. As the final paperwork was prepared, signatures lined up, and the transfer of ownership scheduled I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy, the tension building in a way that made each day feel heavier than the last. Until the day of revelation arrived, quiet and unassuming at first, as I watched my daughter return from a shopping spree, her laughter echoing through the rooms she had claimed as her own, oblivious to the storm about to descend. And then, with the calmness of someone who had long mastered patience, I presented the news, observing the gradual transformation of her expression from casual indifference to confusion, disbelief, and finally, sheer panic, her voice rising, questions tumbling out in frantic succession as she demanded to know how this could be, how the house could have been taken from her, and I, standing firm, explained that her arrogance, disrespect, and insistence on treating my generosity as weakness had brought us to this point, that the sale had been legal, final, and irreversible, and that the lessons she had refused to learn through words alone were now being taught through consequence, the weight of reality pressing upon her in a way that no argument, no tears, no threats could undo. And as I watched her scramble, negotiating desperately, bargaining for a reversal, appealing to family ties and memories she had once taken for granted, I felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow, knowing that the freedom and dignity I had reclaimed could never be returned, that the house I had poured my heart into, though no longer mine, had served its final purpose in teaching the hardest but most necessary lesson of all, that love without respect is fragile, and that entitlement, when unchecked, inevitably meets an immovable force. And as the hours passed, with new owners stepping into their rightful possession, and my daughter finally confronting the reality she had created for herself, I realized that the quiet triumph of patience, strategy, and steadfastness had far more power than anger, shouting, or confrontation ever could, and that sometimes the most profound acts of love are the ones that protect our dignity and teach lessons through action rather than words.
The moment the reality sank in, my daughter's world seemed to crumble in slow motion, her once confident steps faltering as she realized that the security and comfort she had taken for granted were gone, replaced by a sharp, unyielding truth that her entitlement had limits she had never considered. And in the following hours, chaos erupted in the house she had called her own, her screams echoing through empty rooms, slamming doors and windows in a frenzy of disbelief and rage, her phone ringing incessantly with frantic calls to friends, relatives, even distant acquaintances, all of whom offered sympathy but little practical aid. And I watched silently from a distance that allowed me both observation and peace as she tried every tactic she knew, pleading, bargaining, manipulating, even resorting to the unthinkable act of accusing me of betrayal, of being cruel and heartless, all the while ignoring the years of neglect and disrespect she had shown me, as if memory had selectively erased her own failings and magnified mine. Neighbors who had long known of her arrogance whispered behind closed doors, curious about the commotion, and some came forward with stories of their own brushes with her entitlement, while my own emotions roiled in tandem, a strange mixture of sorrow for her distress, pride in the careful orchestration of justice, and relief at the reclaiming of control over a life and a home that had been overshadowed by her hubris. And as she paced, crying and ranting, a part of me mourned not the loss of the house itself, but the loss of the daughter I had once known, the child whose laughter had once filled every room with joy, now replaced by a young woman consumed by anger and desperation. Yet amid this storm of emotion, clarity began to emerge, a quiet understanding that no matter how bitter this lesson might feel to her, it was necessary that boundaries, respect, and accountability are the pillars upon which healthy relationships are built, and that a life coddled by entitlement often crumbles under its own weight, no matter how many privileges it enjoys. And so I remained calm, observing every reaction, every tear, every shouted accusation, knowing that this was the culmination of years of careful patience, that the threads of consequence were finally weaving themselves into the fabric of her understanding. And as evening fell and the new owners of the house settled into their rightful space. She collapsed into a chair, exhausted and stunned, the reality finally seeping into her consciousness that her actions had led to this irreparable outcome. And in that moment, I felt a mixture of pity and satisfaction, understanding that the power of consequence is far more potent than any lecture, any argument, any plea for gratitude. And as the hours turned into a quiet night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From the early days of gentle guidance and unwavering love, to the harsh but necessary enforcement of boundaries and justice, and finally to a place of reflection and closure where my dignity was restored, my patience vindicated, and my daughter, though humbled and shaken, had been presented with a truth she could no longer ignore, a truth that would shape her understanding of respect, entitlement, and the value of family. And as I walked away from the house, leaving her to grapple with the storm she had unleashed upon herself, I felt a profound sense of liberation, a recognition that sometimes love requires firmness, that protecting oneself and one's legacy is an act of courage and compassion, and that even the most painful lessons, when delivered with careful thought and measured action, can become the catalysts for growth, understanding, and eventual reconciliation, leaving both parent and child with the seeds of wisdom that only hardship and consequence can sow. In the weeks that followed the upheaval, the house she had once treated as her personal kingdom settled into the hands of the new owners, its walls echoing not with the arrogance and entitlement that had once dominated every room, but with the quiet energy of people who respected the space, cared for it, and treated it as a home rather than a possession to be taken for granted. And as the reality of her loss sank into my daughter's consciousness, I watched from a distance as she stumbled through a world that no longer bent to her whims, encountering obstacles she had never before faced, the absence of a roof she could claim, the financial responsibility she had ignored, and the simple fact that life had consequences, all coalescing into a humbling education she had spent years avoiding. And in observing her struggle, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pity for the shock and hardship she now endured, and a quiet satisfaction that the lesson I had long contemplated was unfolding exactly as it should, for no lecture, no angry confrontation, no pleading could have etched the truth into her life with the permanence and gravity that consequence now had. And as she scrambled to find temporary housing, navigating apartments and rental agreements, budgeting for expenses she had never considered, and negotiating with landlords who cared little for her past comfort and far more for her ability to meet obligations, I saw the subtle beginnings of change, small cracks in her once impenetrable arrogance, moments where she hesitated before snapping at someone, where she paused to weigh her actions against potential consequences. And though these moments were fleeting and uneven, they were, in their own quiet way, victories in the slow shaping of character. And while I could not claim to know if she would fully embrace humility, the very process of confronting reality had begun to instill in her the awareness that life, unlike the house she had lost, is not something one can take for granted, that relationships require respect, and that kindness, when abused, carries a price. And in my own life, this period became one of reflection, liberation, and rebuilding as I reclaimed routines and spaces that had been overshadowed by her presence, restoring rooms to their original function, replanting a garden she had neglected, and finally allowing myself the small pleasures of a life lived on my own terms, free from constant criticism and the burden of unappreciated generosity. And yet, even in my newfound peace, there remained a cautious awareness, a recognition that my daughter's transformation, if it were to happen, would not occur overnight, that patience was still required, and that the love which had once led me to accommodate her entitlement must now be tempered with boundaries and expectation. A lesson in itself that parenting does not end with provision, but continues through guidance, firmness, and the enforcement of principles. And as the months passed, I saw her adapting slowly, taking jobs she had never held, learning the weight of responsibility through the discipline of daily effort, the sting of financial limitation, and the social humility required when one can no longer assume comfort without merit. And though she often faltered the glimpses of change, her quiet efforts to maintain her new living space, her tentative apologies for past behavior, the occasional acknowledgement of my role in her upbringing, hinted at a glimmer of understanding that life is earned, that respect is reciprocal, and that consequences are not punishments but necessary teachers. And as these small lessons accumulated, I felt a subtle shift in the dynamic between us, one no longer dominated by her entitlement, but gradually shaped by mutual recognition. The slow rebuilding of trust contingent on effort and genuine respect rather than inherited comfort. And through it all, I remained vigilant, neither rushing forgiveness nor allowing old patterns to reemerge, for the stakes were too high and the history too painful. And in this period of adjustment, I also devoted myself to my own growth, embracing hobbies, friendships, and projects I had long set aside, restoring not only my home, but my own sense of identity agency, and fulfillment. And in quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons embedded in the past year, understanding that the pain, chaos, and strategic decisions were as much for me as they were for her, teaching me resilience, clarity, and the sometimes difficult boundary between unconditional love and enabling harmful behavior. And as I observed my daughter navigating her new life, I saw her confronting not just external challenges, but internal ones, facing the discomfort of accountability, the sting of humility, and the laborious work of personal growth. And though her journey was uneven, punctuated by mistakes and regressions, it was real, tangible, and fundamentally necessary, a transformative process that lectures and arguments could never have achieved. And as weeks turned to months, subtle signs of progress emerged. She started managing her finances, showing consideration in interactions, acknowledging the sacrifices of those around her, and cautiously seeking guidance without expecting blind compliance. And while I remained cautious, these signs filled me with hope, a recognition that even the most entitled individuals can learn, adapt, and embrace responsibility when faced with undeniable truth. And as we tentatively rebuilt our relationship, I found that the house, though no longer ours, had served as a catalyst, a symbol of the balance between love and accountability. And in its absence, both of us were learning to navigate a world where respect, gratitude, and effort were no longer optional. And in the quiet evenings, I would reflect on the journey, understanding that justice and compassion often coexist in tension, that the protection of one's dignity and the teaching of life's hard truths is itself an act of profound love. And in this reflective state, I recognize the beauty of transformation, both for my daughter and myself, realizing that though the path had been painful, chaotic, and emotionally draining, it had ultimately fostered growth, restored balance, and laid the foundation for a future where lessons were internalized, respect was earned, and love was no longer exploited but honored. And in this newfound equilibrium, I finally experienced the peace, clarity, and quiet triumph of a father who had loved deeply, acted decisively, and navigated the treacherous terrain of entitlement and consequence with patience, strategy, and unwavering commitment to principles. And as I watched my daughter take her tentative steps toward responsibility, humility, and self-awareness, I understood that the story of the house, of its sale, and of the upheaval it caused would remain a defining chapter in both our lives, a story of love, loss, consequence, and ultimate transformation. And in the reflection of that journey, I found not only closure, but the profound realization that the most lasting lessons in life are those taught not by anger or words, but by the quiet, unyielding presence of truth, the inevitability of consequence, and the enduring strength of patience, strategy, and principled action, leaving both parent and child forever changed, wiser, and prepared to face the world with a newfound understanding of respect, responsibility, and the true meaning of love. As the months stretched on, the rhythm of our lives began to settle into a new pattern, one shaped by lessons learned, boundaries established, and the lingering memory of the house that had once dominated both our worlds. And I observed my daughter navigating her new reality with a mixture of struggle, determination, and the occasional flare of frustration. Each moment a testament to the fact that growth is rarely linear, that humility is often painful, and that the consequences of past actions can weigh heavily, shaping not only behavior but character. And though she faltered at times, forgetting the hard-earned lessons or succumbing briefly to her old impulses of entitlement and arrogance, I noticed subtle, meaningful changes. She began taking responsibility for her decisions, acknowledging mistakes she had once denied, managing her finances with care, negotiating her life with a maturity born from hardship, and cautiously seeking guidance without expecting compliance simply because she demanded it. And in these small victories, I saw the potential for true transformation, a process that had been impossible in the cocoon of a life where comfort was granted without consideration. And while I maintained my own boundaries firmly, refusing to rescue her from the consequences she now faced, I also allowed moments of connection, teaching her, encouraging her, and occasionally reminding her of the principles she had once ignored, always careful to balance firmness with compassion, understanding that the restoration of trust and the teaching of life's hard truths required both patience and consistency. And as I watched her grow in this measured way, I found myself reflecting on the years that had preceded the sale of the house, on the times when I had bent over backward to provide comfort, on the moments when I had ignored my own needs to satisfy hers, and on the realization that love, while boundless, is also a force that must be guided by wisdom, that generosity untempered by expectation can be misused, and that discipline, consequences, and strategic action are sometimes the truest expressions of care. For in teaching respect through consequence rather than argument, one ensures that lessons are internalized, that character is forged, and that future relations, both familial and personal, can be built on the solid foundation of accountability. And as the seasons changed, I saw my daughter applying these principles, awkwardly at first, stumbling through responsibilities, learning the value of work, the satisfaction of self-sufficiency, and the weight of decisions. And though pride still occasionally colored her actions, it was now tempered by understanding, by recognition that the world does not revolve around her desires, and that respect for others is not optional but essential. And in these months, I too found a renewed sense of purpose, embracing hobbies I had neglected, investing time in friendships and personal projects, and reclaiming the quiet dignity that had been overshadowed by years of conflict. And in this renewed focus, I experienced a profound liberation, a realization that while love motivates sacrifice, it also demands the courage to enforce boundaries, to protect one's dignity, and to act decisively when kindness is exploited. And as the relationship between my daughter and me slowly evolved, we began to find moments of genuine connection, small conversations where she sought advice rather than confrontation, gestures of gratitude for support she had once dismissed, and occasional acknowledgments of the lessons she had learned through hardship. And in observing these fragile but meaningful interactions, I understood that growth, both for her and for me, was ongoing, a dynamic process shaped by experience, reflection, and the enduring presence of principles that cannot be ignored. And though the past could not be undone, the present offered opportunity for healing, understanding, and the cautious rebuilding of trust. And as I reflected on the house that had sparked this transformative journey, I saw it not merely as a lost property, but as a catalyst for change, a tangible symbol of the balance between generosity and accountability, love and principle. And in its absence, both of us were learning to navigate life with a newfound appreciation for effort, responsibility, and respect. And as I continued to watch my daughter engage with the world with increasing self-awareness, I recognized that the lessons she had once resisted had begun to shape her character, guiding her toward a path where entitlement no longer dictated her actions, and where gratitude, humility, and consideration for others were emerging as natural, if still tentative, aspects of her behavior. And while the journey was far from complete, these early steps toward maturity offered both reassurance and hope, a reminder that even the most difficult experiences, when navigated with patience, wisdom, and resolve, can foster growth, understanding, and lasting transformation. And as the years continued, I noticed more enduring signs of change. She began taking initiative without prompting, approaching challenges with measured thought, acknowledging my guidance without defensiveness, and even expressing concern for the well-being of others, traits that had been virtually absent before. And in these moments, I felt a quiet pride, tempered by the awareness that character is forged over time and through repeated trials, that the lessons of consequence must be continuously reinforced, and that the true measure of growth lies not in isolated successes, but in the consistency of change over time. And alongside this, I maintained my own life, embracing freedom, pursuing long held dreams, reconnecting with friends, and relishing the quiet satisfaction of a home governed by my own rules and rhythms, rather than the demands of entitlement. And as I observed the evolving dynamics between my daughter and me, I realized that the sale of the house, though painful in its immediate aftermath, had been the most decisive act of guidance I could have undertaken, for it had forced confrontation with reality, demanded accountability, and initiated a transformation that words alone could never have achieved. And in the reflection of this journey, I saw that love, while unconditional in its intent, is most effective when paired with wisdom, courage, and the willingness to act decisively in the face of disregard. For through this balance, both parent and child emerge stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the principles that sustain healthy relationships. And as my daughter continued to navigate her new life with growing competence, independence, and understanding, I felt a deep sense of resolution, a recognition that while the scars of past conflict would remain, the foundations of respect, accountability, and measured affection were now firmly established, and that the lessons learned through the turbulence of the house's sale would resonate throughout her life, shaping choices, behavior, and relationships in ways both subtle and profound. And in the quiet moments of reflection, I realized that this entire experience had been a journey not only for her, but for me as well, a testament to the enduring power of patience, strategic action, and principled love. And as I looked back on the years of sacrifice, confrontation, and ultimately resolution, I understood that the most meaningful victories are not those achieved through force or anger, but through the careful, deliberate alignment of action with principle, and that the ultimate measure of success in parenting lies not in control, compliance, or convenience, but in the cultivation of character, integrity, and mutual respect. And as I observed my daughter stepping into a life guided by these principles, occasionally faltering but steadily improving, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a quiet triumph rooted not in material gain, but in the restoration of dignity, the teaching of life's hard truths, and the emergence of a relationship now built on awareness, accountability, and genuine connection. And as the years continued to unfold, I carried with me the certainty that the challenges we had endured, the conflicts we had faced, and the decisive actions taken in the wake of entitlement would continue to shape both our lives in lasting, meaningful ways, leaving a legacy of lessons learned, boundaries respected, and love tempered with wisdom, a testament to the enduring truth that patience, courage, and principled action are the truest expressions of care, and that even in the face of betrayal, arrogance, and disregard, a parent's guidance, when applied with firmness and foresight, can catalyze transformation, restore balance, and foster growth that extends far beyond the immediate moment, shaping character, relationships, and understanding for a lifetime. And as I reflected on the journey, the turmoil, the chaos, and the eventual resolution, I felt a profound gratitude for the clarity that consequence had provided, for the opportunity to teach through action rather than words alone, and for the chance to witness the slow, deliberate emergence of humility, responsibility, and respect in the daughter I had once feared lost to entitlement. And in that quiet recognition, I finally experienced the deep satisfaction of knowing that the choices I had made, the boundaries I had enforced, and the lessons I had delivered had achieved their purpose, leaving both of us transformed, wiser, and prepared to navigate the complexities of life with greater understanding, compassion, and a shared appreciation for the enduring value of respect, accountability, and principled love. As more time passed and life continued to unfold in its slow, steady rhythm, I found myself observing my daughter with a kind of cautious optimism, the kind that grows only after witnessing both the worst and the unexpected best in a person. And though she still battled moments of frustration and lingering pride, old habits that clung to her like shadows, there was now a visible effort in how she approached the world, a deliberate restraint before speaking, a thoughtful pause before reacting. And these small but meaningful signs told me more than any apology could, that she was genuinely trying to reshape herself, one step at a time. And as she settled into her modest apartment, managing bills, juggling work responsibilities, and learning the day-to-day realities that adulthood demands, I noticed a shift not only in her behavior, but in her entire presence. For entitlement had once filled every corner of her posture, her tone, even the way she walked into a room. But now there was a groundedness in her movements, a softer, more aware version of the woman she had been. And though she never explicitly admitted that losing the house had humbled her, it showed in countless subtle ways. The careful phrasing of her questions, the respect in her silence when she sought guidance, the way she listened instead of interrupting, and the gratitude in her eyes during moments when she feared her words might fall short. And I found myself responding not as a wounded father trying to protect old scars, but as a man who had stood firm, made the right decisions, and was now witnessing the result of that difficult resolve. For the distance between us had not been created in one day, nor could it be healed in one moment. Yet with each conversation, each shared cup of coffee, each hesitant smile exchanged across the table, the wall that had once divided us began to thin, brick by brick, replaced by something more honest, more balanced, more reflective of respect than obligation. And as this transformation unfolded, I often thought back to the day she had tried to kick me out of my own house, the humiliation burning in my chest, the cold certainty in her eyes that she believed she had every right to command me. And remembering that moment no longer filled me with anger, but rather with a solemn clarity, a recognition of how necessary the sale of the house had been, not just for me, but for her. For had I continued to tolerate disrespect in the name of love, she would have remained trapped in entitlement, and I would have remained trapped in resentment, and neither of us would have grown into the people we were becoming now. And as the months turned into a year, we found ourselves slowly creating new traditions. Small lunches at local cafes, quiet evening walks when she visited, moments where she spoke honestly about her challenges at work, her fears, her hopes, and even her regrets. And though she never used the word sorry, her voice carried a sincerity that made the apology unnecessary. For accountability does not always come dressed in confessions. Sometimes it appears in changed behavior, consistent effort, and the humility to admit through action what pride prevents through words. And in witnessing her steady evolution, I also came to understand something deeper about myself, something I had long overlooked, that for years I had allowed my desire to be a good father to blur the lines between support and sacrifice, generosity and self-neglect. And it was only after reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my boundaries that I realized how essential it is for love to coexist with self-respect. For without that balance, love becomes a burden instead of a blessing. And as this understanding settled in my heart, I approached my daughter with a renewed sense of confidence, no longer desperate to fix everything, no longer trying to be her safety net at the expense of my own well-being. but instead offering guidance without surrendering my principles, support without enabling her, old habits and affection without compromising the respect I owed myself. And through this balanced approach, our relationship began to flourish in ways it never had before, transforming from a one sided dependency into something more mutual, more grounded, more reflective of the growth we had both undergone. And as we continued building this new foundation, there were moments, unexpected and tender, where she would share memories from her childhood, moments I had forgotten, small stories sprinkled with nostalgia and quiet appreciation. And in those exchanges, I saw glimpses of the little girl she once had been, the one I had loved with all my heart before entitlement took root. And seeing that version of her again, even briefly, reminded me that the path to healing was not about erasing the past, but about rediscovering the parts worth holding on to. And though challenges still came, days when she felt overwhelmed, moments when she slipped into old habits, nights when fear or frustration clouded her progress, she faced them with a resilience she had not possessed before. And watching her do so filled me with a sense of pride that was gentler, quieter, and far more meaningful than anything rooted in material comfort or superficial success. And in those reflective moments, I often thought of the house, not with regret nor with bitterness, but with gratitude, for it had been the catalyst, the flame that burned away illusions and forced transformation, a symbol of both consequence and renewal. And though it no longer stood as part of our lives, its impact lingered in every step of her growth and every breath of my peace. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a profound sense of hope that the lessons learned, the boundaries enforced, and the changes embraced would continue to shape our relationship for years to come, guiding us toward a bond defined not by possession or expectation, but by respect, understanding, and the quiet, enduring strength of love rebuilt on truth. As more time passed and life continued to unfold in its slow, steady rhythm, I found myself observing my daughter with a cautious optimism, the kind that grows only after witnessing both the worst and the unexpected best in a person. And though she still battled moments of frustration and lingering pride, old habits that clung to her like shadows, there was now a visible effort in how she approached the world, a deliberate restraint before speaking, a thoughtful pause before reacting, and these small but meaningful signs told me more than any apology could, that she was genuinely trying to reshape herself, one step at a time. And as she settled into her modest apartment, managing bills, juggling work responsibilities, and learning the day-to-day realities that adulthood demands, I noticed a shift not only in her behavior, but in her entire presence. For entitlement had once filled every corner of her posture, her tone, even the way she walked into a room. But now there was a groundedness in her movements, a softer, more aware version of the woman she had been. And though she never explicitly admitted that losing the house had humbled her, it showed in countless subtle ways. The careful phrasing of her questions, the respect in her silence when she sought guidance, the way she listened instead of interrupting, and the gratitude in her eyes during moments when she feared her words might fall short. And I found myself responding not as a wounded father trying to protect old scars, but as a man who had stood firm, made the right decisions, and was now witnessing the result of that difficult resolve. For the distance between us had not been created in one day, nor could it be healed in one moment. Yet with each conversation, each shared cup of coffee, each hesitant smile exchanged across the table, the wall that had once divided us began to thin, brick by brick, replaced by something more honest, more balanced, more reflective of respect than obligation. And as this transformation unfolded, I often thought back to the day she had tried to kick me out of my own house, the humiliation burning in my chest, the cold certainty in her eyes that she believed she had every right to command me. And remembering that moment no longer filled me with anger, but rather with a solemn clarity, a recognition of how necessary the sale of the house had been, not just for me, but for her. For had I continued to tolerate disrespect in the name of love, she would have remained trapped in entitlement, and I would have remained trapped in resentment, and neither of us would have grown into the people we were becoming now. And as the months turned into a year, we found ourselves slowly creating new traditions. Small lunches at local cafes, quiet evening walks when she visited, moments where she spoke honestly about her challenges at work, her fears, her hopes, and even her regrets. And though she never used the word sorry, her voice carried a sincerity that made the apology unnecessary, for accountability does not always come dressed in confessions. Sometimes it appears in changed behavior, consistent effort, and the humility to admit through action what pride prevents through words. And in witnessing her steady evolution, I also came to understand something deeper about myself, something I had long overlooked, that for years I had allowed my desire to be a good father to blur the lines between support and sacrifice, generosity and self-neglect. And it was only after reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my boundaries that I realized how essential it is for love to coexist with self respect. For without that balance, love becomes a burden instead of a blessing. And as this understanding settled in my heart, I approached my daughter with a renewed sense of confidence, no longer desperate to fix everything, no longer trying to be her safety net at the expense of my own well being, but instead offering guidance without surrendering my principles, support without enabling her, old habits and affection without compromising the respect I owed myself. And through this balanced approach, our relationship began to flourish in ways it never had before, transforming from a one-sided dependency into something more mutual, more grounded, more reflective of the growth we had both undergone. And as we continued building this new foundation, there were moments, unexpected and tender, where she would share memories from her childhood, moments I had forgotten, small stories sprinkled with nostalgia and quiet appreciation. And in those exchanges, I saw glimpses of the little girl she once had been, the one I had loved with all my heart before entitlement took root. And seeing that version of her again, even briefly, reminded me that the path to healing was not about erasing the past, but about rediscovering the parts worth holding onto. And though challenges still came, days when she felt overwhelmed, moments when she slipped into old habits, nights when fear or frustration clouded her progress, she faced them with a resilience she had not possessed before, and watching her do so filled me with a sense of pride that was gentler, quieter, and far more meaningful than anything rooted in material comfort or superficial success. And in those reflective moments, I often thought of the house, not with regret, nor with bitterness, but with gratitude, for it had been the catalyst, the flame that burned away illusions and forced transformation, a symbol of both consequence and renewal. And though it no longer stood as part of our lives, its impact lingered in every step of her growth and every breath of my peace. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a profound sense of hope that the lessons learned, the boundaries enforced, and the changes embraced would continue to shape our relationship for years to come, guiding us toward a bond defined not by possession or expectation, but by respect, understanding, and the quiet, enduring strength of love rebuilt on truth.
In the days that followed, my daughter drifted like a displaced shadow, moving from one temporary couch to another, trying to mask her humiliation with forced confidence, yet the truth clung to her like a second skin. Everyone knew what had happened, and no amount of dramatic retelling could twist the story in her favor, because the new owners had moved in immediately, proudly posting photos of their dream home, and the neighborhood gossip moved faster than she expected, leaving her no room to spin lies or excuses. Every time she told someone that I had sabotaged her life, the person listening would quietly wonder what kind of daughter treats her father so poorly that he feels compelled to sell his own house to restore order, and though she tried to escape the weight of responsibility by pointing fingers and crafting narratives, the truth would not shift, would not bend, would not give her the comfort of denial. And slowly, painfully, she began to feel the walls closing in, forcing her to reflect on the life she had lived, the entitlement she had carried like armor, and the disrespect she had offered to the one person who had stood by her through every storm. Meanwhile, I found a quiet peace settling into my own days, a rare stillness that I had forgotten existed. Mornings with warm coffee, evenings spent reading or walking without the dread of confrontation or disrespect. And though there was sorrow in knowing that my daughter was suffering, there was also relief that I had finally chosen dignity over appeasement, peace over chaos, and that the decisions I had made were not out of spite, but out of necessity, the kind of necessity that emerges when years of unconditional giving are met with ungratefulness and emotional cruelty. Still, a father's heart is not made of stone, and there were moments when memories of her childhood, her laughter, her innocence, the way she once clung to my hand, rose like ghosts in my mind, whispering reminders of gentler times, filling me with a tenderness I tried not to indulge, because tenderness had been my weakness before, the weakness that allowed her to manipulate, to take advantage, to push boundaries that should never have been crossed. And so I held firm, trusting that life's harsh lessons were sometimes the only teachers capable of reaching people who believed themselves untouchable. And it wasn't long before one such lesson arrived at her doorstep when her closest friend, tired of the emotional drama and constant pity requests, confronted her directly, telling her in blunt words that she had become unbearable, that her sense of entitlement was suffocating, and that the world didn't owe her comfort simply because she had grown accustomed to luxuries she never worked for. The confrontation shattered her last line of emotional defense, forcing her to face a truth she had spent years avoiding, a truth that echoed louder each day, that respect cannot be demanded, only earned, and that she had spent so long believing Queen was the center of the universe that she had forgotten the fundamental value of gratitude and humility. And as she sat alone that night in a tiny rented room with peeling paint and a malfunctioning ceiling fan, her emotions finally broke open, releasing a flood of tears that stretched late into the night. Not just tears of loss, but tears of realization. Realization of the countless chances I had given her, the sacrifices I had made, the comfort she took for granted. And the deep unfairness of her own actions, which she had never acknowledged before because acknowledging them meant admitting she was wrong, something she had always avoided as fiercely as people avoid fire. Meanwhile, I lived my days quietly, unaware of her internal transformation, believing she was still angry, still bitter, still pointing fingers at the world. Until one afternoon, as I sat reading on my porch, I saw her approaching.
Slowly, not with her usual self-assured stride, but with hesitant, fragile steps, her eyes swollen from crying, her shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of years. And for a long moment, she simply stood there, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly, until finally her voice cracked through the silence with a simple, trembling word, Dad. A word so broken that it carried both apology and longing, both regret and hope. And as she stepped forward, tears spilling freely, she whispered the truth she had been running from, that she was sorry, deeply sorry, for her cruelty, her entitlement, her disrespect, and that losing the house had forced her to confront a version of herself she didn't want to see, a version shaped by selfishness and immaturity, and that she finally understood why I had done what I did. And though the pain in her voice pierced my calm like a blade, I held myself steady, watching my grown daughter finally reach the moment of clarity life had pushed her toward. And as she fell into my arms, sobbing in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child, her sorries pouring out in an unstoppable stream, I felt the walls around my heart slowly melt. Not completely, for trust once broken cannot be rebuilt in a single embrace, but enough for compassion to return, enough for forgiveness to plant its first fragile seed. And as the sun dipped behind us, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and gold, I held her tightly, knowing that this moment marked the beginning of a long journey, hers toward maturity, responsibility, and redemption, and mine toward cautious hope, the kind of hope that blooms only when honesty finally replaces denial, and respect returns to a home where it had been missing for far too long. In the weeks that followed our fragile reunion, the atmosphere between us shifted into something delicate and unfamiliar, like two travelers carefully testing the strength of a newly built bridge, uncertain whether the weight of the past would cause it to collapse, or whether patience and effort might fortify it into something unbreakable. My daughter, once fiery and impulsive, now moved with a gentleness that surprised me, offering help where she once demanded favors, listening more than she spoke, and catching herself whenever old habits tried to seep back into her action. And though I welcomed her attempts, I could not ignore the quiet caution that lingered in my heart, a caution forged from years of disrespect and entitlement, a caution that whispered that change must be proven through consistency, not apologies alone. But even with that caution, I watched her learn to embrace humility in ways I never thought possible, taking up small jobs, waitressing, managing appointments at a clinic, even volunteering at a community kitchen, not for money alone, but for the lesson of working for what she wanted. And in each of these roles, she discovered pieces of herself she had long buried, pieces that felt both empowering and grounding. And as she shared her experiences with me over quiet dinners or during slow evening walks, I sensed her learning to value effort, time, and people in ways she never had before. Yet behind her newfound maturity, I could still see flickers of fear, the fear of failing again, the fear of disappointing me, the fear that her past actions had carved a permanent crack in our bond. And though I tried to reassure her with small gestures, soft words, patient listening, the rare but genuine smile, she still battled the shadows of guilt and the weight of her mistakes, often retreating into long silences whenever the past resurfaced in conversation. But healing is rarely linear, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, we found ourselves settling into a rhythm, a gentle, one built not on the lies of perfection, but on the honesty of imperfection, on the understanding that our relationship could grow even with scars, perhaps especially because of them. Still, the world outside our home was not always kind, and she faced whispers, judgmental glances, and reminders of her downfall everywhere she went. Yet instead of collapsing under the pressure, she began to rise, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, proving to herself and others that her identity was not defined by the house she lost or the mistakes she had made, but by the choices she made now, choices rooted in humility and self-awareness. And one day, when she came home smiling, a genuine smile, full of pride rather than forced bravado, she told me she had been offered a stable position at the clinic, a job she had earned through hard work and dedication, not connections or entitlement. And in her eyes I saw a quiet fire reignite, not the old fire of arrogance, but a new flame of purpose, resilience, and hope. And as she grew, I grew too, learning to let go of the resentment I had carried for so long, learning to see her not as the entitled adult who had once thrown me out of my own house, but as the flawed, evolving human being who was finally confronting herself. And though trust returned slowly, cautiously, and sometimes unevenly, it did return, weaving itself through conversations, shared meals, and small moments of vulnerability. Her confessions of fear, my reassurances, her gratitude, my acceptance, and in these moments, our bond began to resemble something stronger than what it had been before. Not a bond based on obligation or parental sacrifice, but one forged through accountability, growth, and mutual respect. Still, the memory of the house lingered between us like a ghost, and one quiet evening she finally addressed it, her voice trembling as she admitted she had once believed the house symbolized security and power, when in truth it symbolized my love, a love she had misused, a love she had mistaken for weakness, and that losing it had forced her to confront the ugliest parts of herself, the parts she now feared ever becoming again. Hearing these words, spoken with sincerity and remorse, softened something deep within me, something I had guarded fiercely, and I found myself telling her that the house had never been the point, that respect, gratitude, and family were the true foundations she had shaken, and that while I could forgive her, rebuilding trust was a journey we would have to walk together, step by step, with honesty, patience, and effort. And in her tearful nod, I saw not just understanding, but commitment, a silent vow to never repeat the mistakes that had torn us apart. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe in her, truly believe in her ability to grow, to learn, to change, to become someone she and I could be proud of. And as the weeks turned into months, our home, though modest, became filled with new memories, shared laughter during dinner, quiet mornings with coffee, evenings spent discussing her ambitions, her dreams, her fears. And though life no longer revolved around wealth or ownership, it revolved around something far more precious: understanding, connection, and the slow but steady rebuilding of a bond that had once been nearly destroyed by pride, entitlement, and resentment. And in this slow, beautiful rebuilding, I learned that even the most broken relationships can heal if both hearts choose growth over stubbornness, humility over ego, and honesty over denial. And I watched her transform from a girl who believed the world owed her everything into a woman who worked for what she wanted, who respected not just me but herself, who carried herself not with arrogance but with dignity. And in that transformation, I found a peace I had never known, a peace rooted in the realization that sometimes losing everything is what makes people finally understand the value of what truly matters. As the months stretched into a full year, the transformation in my daughter no longer felt like a fragile shift, but a permanent change, solid and steady, like a tree that had finally grown deep roots after years of wavering in shallow soil. And it became clear to both of us that she was ready, ready to live on her own terms, ready to stand without leaning on me, ready to build a life shaped not by entitlement, but by effort and self-respect. And when she came to me one morning, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and nervousness, and told me she had found a small but beautiful apartment near her workplace, a place she could afford with her own earnings, a place that was truly hers. I felt a warmth bloom inside me, a quiet satisfaction that this chapter of growth had reached its natural next step. And though a part of me felt the familiar ache of letting go, the larger part felt gratitude. Gratitude that she had reached this milestone, not through privilege, but through perseverance, humility, and resilience. And as moving day approached, she invited me to see the apartment. And when we walked through its modest rooms, sunlight spilling across simple wooden floors, a small balcony overlooking a busy street, walls still bare and echoing, I saw her smile with genuine contentment, not longing for luxury, not comparing it to anything she once had, but appreciating it for what it represented: independence, responsibility, and a new beginning forged through her own hands. And when she turned to me, her voice soft but steady, and said, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes because the weight of that gratitude was something I had waited years to hear, something that finally marked the closing of the wound she had inflicted when she tried to throw me out of the house I built with my own sacrifice. And in that small sunlit apartment, we shared a long, quiet embrace. An embrace not of desperation or apology, but of mutual understanding, forgiveness, and respect. And in the weeks that followed, she moved into her new home with excitement rather than fear, decorating it slowly, piece by piece, inviting me for dinner once a week, eager to show me her cooking skills, her new routines, her growing confidence, and every visit felt like stepping into a life that had healed, a life that had finally balanced the scales between giving and receiving, love and responsibility. Yet the journey reached its true closure when she asked me one evening to take a walk with her, and we ended up standing outside the old house, the place that had once been a battleground of entitlement and resentment, the place she had treated like her inheritance rather than a gift, the place whose sale had triggered the turning point of her life. And she looked at it with a calm sadness, not clinging to the past, but acknowledging it. And she said, "Losing this house broke me, but it also saved me." And hearing those words, spoken with sincerity, maturity, and a deep understanding of her own journey, I realized that the story had come full circle, that the painful decision I once made alone had now become the foundation of her growth, the catalyst that pushed her into becoming the woman she was always capable of being. And as we stood there watching the lights inside flicker on, belonging now to another family, a different story entirely, there was no anger, no regret, no bitterness, only acceptance and peace, as though the universe itself had breathed out the last remnants of tension that had tied us to that place. And she turned to me then, her voice steady, her eyes clear, and said the words that would forever close the wound between us. "Dad, I understand now. You didn't take anything from me. You gave me everything I needed to grow." And the simplicity of those words, the honesty woven into them, struck me with a quiet force. And in that moment, I felt the weight of years lift off my shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of closure, as though every step of this long, painful journey had led us exactly here, not to the destruction of our bond, but to its rebirth. And in the months that followed, her life blossomed in ways that filled me with pride. She excelled in her job, earned promotions, built friendships rooted not in convenience, but in genuine care, and even began mentoring younger colleagues who struggled with entitlement and insecurity, using her own experiences as a guide. And through this, she discovered her own capacity to inspire, to lead, to be the kind of person others looked up to, not because of wealth or privilege, but because of her heart, her humility, her resilience. And as for me, I found myself embracing a quieter, more peaceful life, a life where I no longer carried the burden of being taken for granted, a life where my relationship with my daughter was built on mutual respect rather than obligation, a life where love could flow without the contamination of resentment or fear. And though the scars of our past remained faint reminders of where we had once gone wrong, they no longer ached. They served only as markers of how far we had come, how much we had grown, how deeply we had healed. And one evening, as she visited me for dinner in my small home, laughing as she told me stories from work, setting the table with practiced ease, I looked at her, this confident, humble, compassionate woman she had become, and I realized that my story was no longer a story of loss or betrayal or heartbreak. It was a story of growth, of redemption, of the extraordinary transformation that occurs when love is paired with accountability, when consequences are guided by compassion, when forgiveness is earned, not demanded. And as we sat down to eat, sharing warm food and warmer conversation, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my heart, a certainty that the chapter of pain had closed forever, replaced by a future built on trust, gratitude, and a bond stronger than any house, any property, any material thing could ever offer. And in that peaceful, comforting silence between us, I knew one truth above all, that sometimes the hardest decisions create the most beautiful endings. And though our journey had been long and painful, it had led us to a place of understanding that neither of us could have reached without the storm that came before, a place where father and daughter could finally sit side by side, not as adversaries, not as strangers, but as family, healed, reunited, and stronger than ever.